The news spread through Copper Ridge like poison in a well. Silas Ward pressed his ear against the cabin wall, his weathered hands trembling as Ruby's voice drifted through the wooden planks. 25 years of silence, 25 years of unspoken rules, shattered by words no woman should know to speak. "She knows about the mine," he whispered to Boone Carter, who stood frozen beside him. "How in hell does she know about the mine?" Boone's young face had gone pale as winter snow. He'd been barely 3 when the last woman left Copper Ridge, when they all left. The stories passed down through hushed conversations around dying fires had painted those final days in blood and regret. But stories were supposed to stay buried with the dead. Inside the cabin, Ruby's laughter cut through the mountain air like a blade through flesh. It was a sound that belonged to a different world, a world these men had agreed to abandon forever. "We should get the others," Boone stammered, backing away from the wall. His boots scraped against loose stones, each sound amplifying in the oppressive quiet that had settled over the settlement. But Silas remained pressed against the wood, listening to every word that fell from Ruby's lips. She spoke of things that should have died with Margaret Wheeler, the settlement's former keeper of secrets. She mentioned names that hadn't been spoken aloud since the day they burned the church and declared Copper Ridge a place where women could never again set foot. "Margaret told me about the choice you made," Ruby was saying now, her voice carrying the weight of knowledge that could destroy them all. "About what you sacrificed to keep the silver flowing, about the price you agreed to pay." Malachi's response came as a growl, desperate, cornered. "Margaret died with the rest of them. Whatever she told you died with her." "Did it?" Ruby's voice held no fear, only certainty. "Because I have her journal, Malachi. Every page, every word, every name of every woman who disappeared into these mountains and never came back out." The silence that followed stretched like a rope ready to snap. Silas felt his blood turn to ice water. Margaret Wheeler's journal was supposed to have burned with everything else, with the church, with the records, with any trace of what Copper Ridge had been before it became a tomb for 37 men and their guilty consciences. But if Ruby truly possessed those pages, then she held more than just secrets. She held the power to expose a truth that would bring lawmen, questions, and justice to a place that had spent 25 years convincing itself that justice had already been served. Boone grabbed Silas by the shoulder, pulling him away from the cabin wall. "We need to tell the others. Now." But as they turned to run, Ruby's voice followed them into the gathering darkness, carrying words that made their blood freeze in their veins. "And I know which one of you killed her." The settlement's bell hadn't rung in 15 years. But Silas Ward pulled that rope like his life depended on it. Men emerged from cabins, mines, and worksheds with the sluggish movements of creatures disturbed from deep sleep. Their faces carried the same weathered emptiness that came from decades of isolation, but now something else flickered in their eyes. Fear. "She's got Margaret's journal," Silas announced to the gathering crowd, his voice cracking like dry wood. "She knows about the agreement." A murmur rippled through the 37 men who called Copper Ridge home. Old wounds they'd spent years convincing themselves had healed began to throb with remembered pain. Boone Carter pushed through the crowd, his young face flushed with panic. "She says one of us killed Margaret, that she has proof." The murmur died. Jasper Slade stepped forward, his massive frame casting shadows across the ground. At 62, he was the oldest among them, the one who'd helped write the rules that governed their isolated world. His scarred hands shook as he spoke. "Margaret Wheeler died in the church fire with the others. We all saw the flames. We all helped bury what was left. Did we?" The voice belonged to Orville Banks, a thin man whose nervous habits had grown worse with each passing year. "Because I remember her running toward the trees. I remember seeing her reach the forest line before the smoke got too thick to see anything." Several men nodded, their memories suddenly unreliable, fragmented by time and guilt. "Doesn't matter what any of us remember," growled Fletcher Knox, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "What matters is what that woman thinks she knows." Through the cabin window, they could see Ruby's silhouette moving against the lamplight. She appeared calm, unhurried, as if she held all the time in the world while they scrambled like ants from a disturbed hill. "We should vote," suggested Wade Langston, his voice barely above a whisper. "Same as we did before. Same as we did when we made the agreement." The word vote hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. It carried weight these men hadn't felt in 25 years, the weight of collective guilt, shared secrets, and decisions that had damned them all. Malachi's cabin door creaked open, and every man turned toward the sound. Their leader emerged, his face carved from stone, his eyes reflecting the last light of day like polished metal. "There won't be a vote," he said, his voice cutting through their whispered fears, "because she's not going anywhere." Behind him, Ruby appeared in the doorway, her green eyes sweeping across the assembled men with the confidence of someone who held all the winning cards in a deadly game. "Hello, boys," she said, her voice carrying across the settlement like honey poured over broken glass. "I believe we have some things to discuss." She stepped down from the cabin, her boots striking the ground with deliberate precision. In her hand, she carried a leather-bound book that seemed to pulse with the weight of buried truths. But as her gaze moved from face to face, searching, cataloging, remembering, one question burned brighter than all the others. How had a woman who should have been dead for 25 years managed to survive long enough to pass her secrets to someone else? Ruby opened the leather journal, its pages yellowed with age and secrets. "Margaret Wheeler wrote about the night you made your choice," she announced, her voice carrying across the settlement like a judge reading a sentence. "October 15th, the night the silver vein ran dry." Malachi's jaw tightened. Several men shifted uncomfortably, their boots scraping against the hard-packed earth. That date lived in their nightmares, the moment their prosperity died and desperation took its place. "The mine had been their livelihood for 12 years, Ruby continued, reading from the journal's brittle pages. Wives, daughters, sisters, 23 women who'd built lives in these mountains. But when the silver stopped flowing, the choices became difficult. Jasper Slade stepped forward, his massive frame trembling with suppressed rage. "You don't know what it was like. You weren't here when the food ran out, when winter came early, when we realized we'd all starve before spring. But I know what you decided," Ruby replied, her green eyes never leaving the journal. "Margaret wrote it all down. How you voted, who spoke for exile and who spoke for something worse." The silence stretched like a rope about to snap. Orville Banks broke first, his nervous voice cracking. "We gave them supplies. We gave them horses. We didn't force them to leave empty-handed. Into mountains crawling with winter storms and predators," Ruby shot back. 23 women and children, sent to die slowly instead of quickly. Boone Carter's young face had gone pale. He'd grown up on sanitized stories about brave pioneers seeking new opportunities. The truth felt like poison spreading through his veins. "Margaret stayed behind," Wade Langston whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Said someone needed to bear witness. Said someone needed to remember their names." Ruby's smile held no warmth, and for 6 months, she did exactly that. Wrote down every woman's name, every child's age, every promise you broke, until she became inconvenient. Malachi stepped closer, his hands clenched into fists. "Margaret chose to stay. She chose to keep records we didn't want kept. She chose to make herself a problem. And someone chose to solve that problem," Ruby replied, closing the journal with a soft thud. "Someone decided Margaret Wheeler knew too much, remembered too much, judged too much." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of old timber and older guilt through the settlement. Men who'd spent 25 years convincing themselves they'd made necessary choices suddenly found those convictions crumbling like rotten wood. "The question is," Ruby continued, her gaze moving from face to face with surgical precision, "which one of you decided Margaret needed to join the others?" Fletcher Knox spat into the dirt, his patience finally snapping. "Even if that book is real, even if Margaret wrote down every damned word, what's it matter now? They're all dead. Margaret's dead. You showing up with ancient secrets won't bring any of them back." Ruby's laughter cut through the evening air like a blade through silk. "Who said anything about bringing them back?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the settlement. "I'm here to make sure you join them." The men of Copper Ridge suddenly realized they weren't dealing with just another woman seeking answers about the past. They were facing someone who'd come to collect a debt 25 years overdue. The men of Copper Ridge formed a loose circle around Ruby, but none dared step closer. Malachi's mind raced through possibilities, searching for some explanation that didn't end with their destruction. "You're not here for justice. You're here for revenge." "Justice and revenge," Ruby replied, tucking the journal inside her coat. "Sometimes they wear the same face." Silas Ward cleared his throat, his weathered hands trembling. "Who are you? Really?" For the first time since her arrival, Ruby's composure cracked slightly. Something flickered across her features. Pain, perhaps, or memory sharp enough to draw blood. "I'm the daughter Margaret never had," she said finally, the one she chose to save instead of condemn. The words hit the assembled men like physical blows. They'd convinced themselves that Margaret Wheeler died alone, that her secrets died with her. But if she'd found someone to carry her burden, someone to remember. Margaret found me half dead in the forest 3 days after the fire, Ruby continued, her voice steady despite the emotion burning in her green eyes. 8 years old, starving, wearing a dead woman's clothes. Boone Carter's face went white. You're one of them. One of the women we sent to die? Ruby finished. Yes, though technically I wasn't a woman then, just a girl who watched her mother freeze to death because 37 men decided their comfort mattered more than 23 lives. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush stone. Orville Banks stepped back, shaking his head frantically. We voted. It was democratic. We gave them supplies, horses. 3 days' food for a month's journey. Ruby cut him off. Horses too old and weak to carry riders through mountain passes. Blankets thin enough to see through. Fletcher Knox hawked and spat. Better than starving here with the rest of us. Was it? Ruby's voice dropped to a whisper that carried like thunder. Because I buried my mother with these hands. Watched my sister die from fever we couldn't treat. Saw Margaret nurse 12 women and children through their final hours while she wrote down every word, every promise, every lie you told yourselves to sleep at night. Malachi felt the ground shifting beneath his feet like sand in a river. 25 years of careful silence, 25 years of managed guilt, crumbling in the space of a single evening. Margaret kept us alive for 3 years, Ruby continued, her eyes finding his across the gathering darkness. Fed us, sheltered us, told us stories about better places while we taught ourselves to survive in the wilderness. And then, Wade Langston asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. Then someone decided Margaret's mercy had become inconvenient. Ruby's smile returned, cold as winter wind. Someone decided the witness needed to become another victim. I was 11 when I buried her with these same hands. The men exchanged glances loaded with suspicion and fear. For 25 years, they'd lived with the shared weight of their decision, but they'd also lived with trust. Now that trust began to fracture, as each man wondered which of his neighbors had added murder to exile. Margaret made me promise something before she died, Ruby said, pulling a small object from her pocket, a silver locket that caught the last light of day. She made me swear I'd come back when I was strong enough. It took me 22 years to honor that promise. Jasper Slade's eyes fixed on the locket with recognition that made his blood run cold. That belonged to Sarah Hollis, Margaret's sister. Margaret gave it to me with her dying breath, Ruby confirmed, along with her journal, her secrets, and her final wish. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of loose shutters banging against cabin walls like a countdown to something terrible. What wish? Malachi asked, though he already feared the answer. Ruby opened the locket, revealing a small photograph of a woman who looked remarkably like her. The same green eyes, the same determined jawline. That I'd make sure every man who voted that night got exactly what he deserved. If this story is touching you in any way, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with someone who loves a good Western tale, and subscribe to the Western Redemption channel. Every single day at exactly 10 a.m., a brand new story drops, packed with emotion, justice, and redemption. So turn on the notification bell and don't miss the next chapter. Because out here in the West, no one waits around. The photograph in the locket revealed a face that several men recognized with dawning horror. Sarah Hollis, whispered Jasper Slade, his voice cracking like old leather. Margaret's younger sister. She was barely 18 when the vote happened. Ruby closed the locket with deliberate care, her green eyes never leaving the assembled faces. My mother. She made it 4 weeks in those mountains before the fever took her. Malachi felt the weight of 25 years pressing down on his shoulders like stones. Sarah Hollis had been among the youngest of the women they'd exiled, barely more than a child, with no husband to protect her and no skills for wilderness survival. We didn't know she had a daughter, Wade Langston mumbled, his words sounding hollow even to himself. You didn't ask, Ruby replied. You just counted heads and calculated how much less food you'd need to share. Boone Carter stepped back, shaking his head frantically. I wasn't part of that vote. I was just a child. So was I, Ruby said, her voice cutting through his protest like a blade through cloth. But that didn't save my mother from freezing to death in a cave while you slept warm in your beds. The men began to shift nervously. their circle widening as suspicion took root among them. For 25 years they'd shared the collective guilt of exile. But murder was different. Murder belonged to one man, and that man stood among them now, breathing the same air, wearing the same mask of innocence. Fletcher Knox spat tobacco juice into the dirt, his patience finally exhausted. "So what's your plan, girl? You gonna pick us off one by one? Poison our water? Burn our cabins while we sleep?" Ruby smiled, and the expression held no warmth whatsoever. "Nothing so dramatic. I'm going to do exactly what you did to us." The silence stretched like a rope ready to snap. "I'm going to make you choose," she continued, pulling a small silver bell from her pocket, the same bell Margaret had carried to call the women to evening meals. "Just like you chose 25 years ago." Orville Banks backed away, his nervous habits intensifying. "Choose what?" "Who killed Margaret Wheeler?" Ruby announced. "Because someone in this circle decided she'd become too dangerous to live. Someone crept into her cabin while she tended my mother's fever. Someone put his hands around her throat and squeezed until she stopped writing in that journal forever." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Men who'd lived as neighbors, worked side by side, shared meals and hardships, suddenly found themselves studying faces they thought they knew. "That's impossible," Silas Ward protested. "Margaret died in the fire with the others." "Margaret died 3 years after the fire," Ruby corrected. "Her body is buried in the forest behind her cabin. Under a cairn of stones, she taught me to stack. The grave is still there, still marked with her name carved into a wooden cross." Several men paled at this revelation. They'd spent 25 years believing their witness had died in flames, their secrets consumed by fire. Learning she'd survived, that she'd continued recording their shame, made their carefully constructed peace feel as fragile as morning frost. "You have until sunrise," Ruby announced, her voice carrying across the settlement like a judge's final sentence. "Choose the man who murdered Margaret Wheeler, and the rest of you live." Malachi stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "And if we refuse?" Ruby's smile returned, cold as winter starlight. "Then I'll choose for you, and my justice won't be nearly as merciful as yours." The men scattered like startled animals, their 25 years of brotherhood dissolving into suspicion and fear. Malachi remained in the settlement's center, watching Ruby settle onto the steps of his cabin as if she owned the place. The silver bell rested in her lap, catching starlight like captured tears. "You can't seriously expect us to turn on each other," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Why not?" Ruby replied, not looking up from the bell's polished surface. "You turned on 23 women and children easily enough." Around them, cabin doors slammed shut, and windows went dark. But Malachi could see shadows moving behind curtains, could hear urgent whispers carried on the mountain wind. The settlement had become a trap, and every man inside it suddenly felt like prey. Silas Ward approached carefully, his weathered hands shaking. "Even if one of us did what you're claiming, how would we know which one?" Ruby finally looked up, her green eyes reflecting the lamplight like polished stones. Margaret wrote down everything, every conversation she overheard, every man who visited her cabin, every excuse they gave for why she needed to disappear. The old man's face went pale. "You're asking us to guess." "I'm asking you to remember," Ruby corrected. "Because the man who killed Margaret made mistakes, left evidence, told lies that didn't match the truth Margaret recorded in her journal." From behind a nearby cabin came the sound of raised voices, Orville Banks arguing with Fletcher Knox, their lifelong friendship cracking under the weight of mutual suspicion. "She's tearing us apart," Malachi muttered. "Good," Ruby said simply. "You should know how it feels to watch your family destroy itself." Boone Carter emerged from the shadows, his young face drawn with exhaustion and fear. "What if we can't choose? What if we honestly don't know?" Ruby stood, brushing dust from her worn traveling clothes. "Then you'll learn what it means to face consequences without certainty, just like my mother did when you sent her into those mountains to die." The wind picked up, carrying voices from across the settlement. Men who'd shared meals and hardships for decades now questioned every conversation, every glance, every moment of solitude that might have provided opportunity for murder. "There's something else," Ruby continued, pulling a folded paper from her coat pocket. "Margaret didn't just write about the night she died. She wrote about the days leading up to it, about the man who kept visiting her cabin, about the promises he made, and the threats he whispered when he thought no one could hear." Malachi felt his blood turn to ice water. What kind of promises? The kind a guilty man makes when he realizes his witness might not stay silent forever. Ruby unfolded the paper, revealing Margaret's careful handwriting. He told her they could start over, build something new, maybe even find some of the women who'd survived the winter. The words hit Malachi like physical blows. He'd spoken those exact words to Margaret during their final conversation, the night before her death. But he hadn't been the only one to visit her cabin in those final weeks. He also told her she was becoming dangerous, Ruby continued. Said people were starting to ask questions about the fire, about why she'd survived when others didn't. Said maybe it would be better for everyone if she just disappeared. From across the settlement came the sound of breaking glass, someone's temper finally snapping under the pressure of accusation and counter-accusation. Ruby folded the paper and returned it to her coat. The murderer is still here, still breathing, still pretending he's just another victim of circumstance. But Margaret saw through his lies. And now, thanks to her journal, so do I. The settlement bell tower chimed midnight, its bronze voice echoing across the mountains like a funeral knell. 6 hours until sunrise, Ruby announced, settling back onto the cabin steps. 6 hours to decide whether you'll face the truth together, or let it tear you apart one by one. In the growing darkness, the men of Copper Ridge realized they were no longer hunting for a killer. They were being hunted by their own guilty consciences. Dawn crept across Copper Ridge like blood through water, revealing the wreckage of a community that had torn itself apart in a single night. 3 cabins showed signs of violence. Broken windows, splintered doors, overturned furniture scattered in the dirt. Men who'd shared meals and hardships for 25 years had turned on each other like wolves in winter, their brotherhood dissolving under the weight of accusation and fear. Ruby remained on Malachi's cabin steps, Margaret's journal open in her lap, watching the settlement destroy itself exactly as she'd planned. Time's up, she announced as the sun touched the mountain peaks. The surviving men emerged from their hiding places like beaten animals. Several sported fresh bruises and cuts from the night's confrontations. Orville Banks limped badly, his nervous habits replaced by the dull stare of a man who'd seen too much violence in too little time. We couldn't agree, Silas Ward said, his weathered face drawn with exhaustion. Every man accused his neighbor. Every neighbor pointed fingers back. Ruby closed the journal with deliberate care. Then I'll tell you what Margaret wrote. She stood, brushing dust from her traveling clothes, her green eyes moving across the assembled faces with surgical precision. The man who killed Margaret visited her cabin every evening for 2 weeks before her death, Ruby began, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade through silk. He brought her food, medicine for the sick children, promises of a better future. Several men shifted uncomfortably, their boots scraping against the hard-packed earth. He told her he'd changed his mind about the exile, said maybe they could find some of the women who'd survived the winter. Bring them back. Start over. Ruby pulled a folded page from the journal. Margaret wrote down every word he spoke. Malachi felt his blood turn to ice water. Those were his words, his promises, his lies spoken in desperation to a woman whose conscience had become inconvenient. But Margaret wasn't fooled, Ruby continued. She knew he was trying to discover how much evidence she'd gathered, how many names she'd recorded, how much damage her testimony could cause. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of smoke from dying fires and the metallic taste of spilled blood. On the night he killed her, he came with different words, Ruby said, unfolding Margaret's final entry. He told her the other men were growing suspicious, said they were planning to deal with her themselves unless she disappeared quietly. Fletcher Knox spat tobacco juice into the dirt, his patience exhausted. Just tell us who it was. Ruby smiled, and the expression held no mercy whatsoever. Margaret wrote his name in her final entry, along with a detailed description of exactly how he strangled her with his own belt. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush stone. But before I reveal his identity, Ruby continued, pulling a coil of rope from her traveling pack, I want to give him the same choice he gave Margaret Wheeler. She tied a noose with practiced efficiency, the rope responding to her hands like an old friend. Confess voluntarily and die quickly, she announced, holding up the finished knot. Or let me drag the truth from you in front of everyone and die slowly. The men of Copper Ridge suddenly realized that justice had arrived in their forgotten settlement, and it wore the face of an 8-year-old girl whose childhood they'd murdered 25 years ago. Malachi Brooks stepped forward, his hands trembling like autumn leaves. "It was me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I killed Margaret Wheeler." The confession hit the assembled men like a physical blow. Their leader, the man who'd guided them through 25 years of isolation, had been carrying the weight of murder alongside the burden of exile. Ruby nodded, showing no surprise. "Tell them why." Malachi's shoulders sagged under the weight of buried truth. She was going to leave, take her journal to the authorities down in Denver. Said she couldn't live with the secret anymore. "And you couldn't live with the consequences," Ruby finished. 23 women and children, Malachi continued, his voice cracking like old leather. "If she'd talked, they would have hanged us all. I convinced myself I was saving 37 lives by taking one." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine needles and old guilt through the settlement. Ruby lifted the noose, testing its weight. "Margaret wrote that you cried while you strangled her, that you begged her forgiveness even as you squeezed the life from her throat. I never wanted to hurt anyone," Malachi whispered. "But choices have consequences." "Yes," Ruby agreed, stepping closer. "They do." But instead of slipping the noose around Malachi's neck, Ruby walked to the settlement's old bell post and secured the rope to its iron bracket. "I spent 22 years planning this moment," she announced to the gathering. 22 years imagining how I'd make you pay for what you did to us." She pulled a second object from her traveling pack, a thick bundle of official papers sealed with red wax. "But revenge and justice aren't always the same thing," Ruby continued, breaking the seal. "These are warrants signed by a federal marshal in Denver for the arrest of 37 men wanted in connection with the disappearance of 23 women and children." The papers fluttered in the mountain breeze like dying birds. "They'll be here by sunset," Ruby said simply. "Every one of you will face trial for what you did. The survivors will testify. The evidence will be presented. Justice will be served properly." Malachi stared at her, confused. "Then why the rope?" Ruby's green eyes found his across the space between them, and for a moment, she looked exactly like the 8-year-old girl who'd buried her mother in the frozen ground. "Because some choices can't be undone," she said quietly. "And some men can't live with the weight of what they've done." She turned and walked toward the forest path, Margaret's journal tucked safely under her arm. "The marshals will find you here, or they'll find your bodies. Either way, the women of Copper Ridge will finally have their justice." As Ruby disappeared into the trees, Malachi Brooks looked at the noose swaying in the morning breeze, then at the faces of the men he'd led into damnation 25 years ago. Behind them, smoke began rising from the valley below. Dust clouds kicked up by approaching horses carrying badges, warrants, and the long arm of justice that had finally found its way to their forgotten settlement. The choice was theirs to make, but this time, there would be consequences that couldn't be buried in silence. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.